He went into the mountains just to ride alone, but accidentally came across an object under the ice that was never meant to exist. When he looked inside, he saw something that made him tremble with fear. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which country you're watching from. The mountain range had no name on modern tourist maps, and that absence was not an accident. It lay beyond the edges of marked ski zones and well outside the limits of avalanche-controlled corridors, a spine of rock and ice that rose like a frozen scar across the horizon. People who ventured here usually did so with ropes and ice axes, not snowboards, and almost never alone. Yet, for Marcus Hale, this unnamed ridge had become an obsession, not as a conquest but as a quiet refuge from places where every movement was observed, recorded, filtered through lenses and expectations. Marcus was not a professional athlete. He had no sponsors, no camera crew following him into the wild. He worked seasonal jobs, saved for months, then vanished into mountains with nothing but his gear and his own discipline. Years of careful training had given him something far more valuable than bravado. He carried a habit of restraint that had been shaped by mistakes survived and by friends lost to recklessness. He had learned to listen to snow, to wind, to the smallest changes in temperature that could turn a solid face into a death trap within minutes. He never trusted adrenaline. He trusted preparation. That morning, he had left his small base shelter long before sunrise. The air was so cold that each breath felt like biting into glass, but the sky was cloudless and pale, a fragile promise of a stable window in a season that rarely offered such mercy. He moved methodically, checking his avalanche transceiver, testing the integrity of his probe, running gloved fingers across the seams of his jacket for any sign of moisture intrusion. The satellite tracker on his shoulder blinked green, a thin thread of connection to a world that otherwise did not exist up here. Once he started climbing, that blinking light would be his only voice. The approach to the ridge was slow and punishing. Every step on the steepening slope demanded attention as the wind-packed surface gave way to softer layers beneath. The crunch under his boots was not uniform. In some places it rang with reassuring density. In others it whispered hollow warnings that forced him to stop, backtrack, test again. The range had its own language, and it spoke through subtle shifts that only patience could interpret. He advanced by reading those signs, adjusting his path not according to ambition, but to survival. By mid-morning, he had gained the upper spine of the ridge. From there, the view opened into a sweeping amphitheater of frozen valleys, serrated peaks dissolving into the haze of distance. It was a landscape stripped of color, reduced to shades of steel and bone, yet it held a strange warmth for him. In places like this, the world simplified itself. There were no emails waiting, no social feeds to scroll through, no voices demanding explanation. There was only gravity, weather, and the small rectangle of snow directly beneath his board. The line he had chosen had existed only in his head until that moment. An angled descent through a narrow couloir that pinched between two granite ribs before spilling into a wide glacial shelf. He had traced it countless times on satellite imagery, overlaying old topographic scans that hinted at crevasses hidden beneath the ice. Now he stood at the lip of it, feeling the slope vibrate faintly under the pressure of his weight. The wind picked up in short, violent bursts that slapped the fabric of his jacket like a reprimand. He waited. That was always the most difficult part. The instinct to go was strong, a physical pull as real as gravity, but he forced himself to stand still until the mountain settled into a rhythm he could accept. Only when the gusts spaced out and the snowpack remained quiet did he push off. The first turns were cautious, carved across the face rather than down it, letting the board test the surface before committing. The couloir tightened quickly, its walls rising like frozen jaws on either side. His breathing slowed, aligning with the cadence of movement, a practiced ritual that shut out everything but balance and control. The sound of his descent was swallowed by the vastness around him, leaving him wrapped in a silence that felt almost religious. Halfway down, he veered toward a shallow ledge he had marked as a rest point. As he glided onto it, something caught the edge of his vision, a glint that did not belong to rock or snow. He slowed instinctively, scanning the surface. At first, he saw nothing unusual. The ledge was a patchwork of wind-scoured ice and shallow drifts, a transitional zone where the glacier beneath made its presence felt through subtle undulations. Then he noticed it again, a faint, dull reflection buried just below a thin crust of snow, no larger than the head of a nail. It was not bright enough to be a mineral vein and not angular enough to be fractured stone. He crouched, brushed the surface gently with the back of his glove, and felt something unyielding beneath the powder. The mountain had a way of playing tricks on tired eyes, and Marcus had learned not to trust the first impression. He straightened, stepped back to a safe point, and studied the slope above for any sign of instability he might have triggered. Everything remained quiet. The ledge held firm, its edges locked into the ice of the larger formation beneath. Curiosity crept in, tempered by a heavier weight of caution. He probed the spot with the tip of his pole. The resistance was solid, metallic in its dull echo, utterly alien to the organic palette of the ridge. His heart rate ticked upward, not with excitement, but with the careful alertness that preceded every serious decision in the back country. He cleared a little more snow, enough to reveal a sliver of curved surface, its color muted by decades or centuries of exposure. It was not the broken wing of a plane or the familiar wreckage of modern debris. The curve was too deliberate, too smooth, and its edge vanished beneath the ice as if the mountain had swallowed something whole. A sudden, hollow sound pulsed through the snowpack under his boots. It was not loud, but it was wrong. The surface sagged imperceptibly, enough to make his stomach clench. He retreated 2 steps, planting his board sideways to distribute weight, and waited for the echo of collapse that did not come. Whatever lay beneath that ledge was not a shallow fragment. It was large enough to alter the structure of the glacier itself. He did not dig further. Instinct told him that this was not a discovery to be chased in the middle of a narrow descent corridor with the weather turning and daylight already bleeding from the sky. Instead, he reached for his tracker, marking the coordinates with care that bordered on reverence. He photographed the exposed fragment from several angles, including the surrounding terrain, embedding context into every frame so he would not be tempted later to exaggerate or misremember. The wind began to rise again, threads of spindrift curling off the ridge like smoke. He sealed the spot with a light layer of snow, not to hide it, but to protect it from further erosion until he could return with the right approach. The mountain did not owe him patience, and he knew better than to press his luck. The remainder of the descent passed in a blur of controlled urgency. His mind replayed the shape of that curve, the strange certainty of its artificial origin, even as his body performed the familiar choreography of survival. By the time he reached the lower shelf and the terrain eased into something that resembled mercy, the sky had darkened to a bruised blue and the temperature had dropped another few degrees. He did not feel triumph when he finally reached the relative safety of the basin below. He felt unease, the heavy sense that he had crossed an invisible threshold. He had come into the mountains seeking solitude and clarity, and instead he had brushed against something that refused to be categorized, something that waited patiently beneath ice that had been forming long before he was born. That night in his shelter, the wind clawing at the thin walls of fabric, Marcus lay awake long after his muscles begged for sleep. The coordinates glowed faintly on his tracker's screen, an unblinking reminder that the ridge above was no longer just a blank expanse on an outdated map. It had become a question, one he could not answer alone, but one he now carried with him like a weight that refused to be set down. Sleep never truly came that night. It hovered around Marcus like a distant memory, brushing his thoughts without claiming them, leaving him half aware of every groan of the wind and every creak of his small shelter as the ridge above tested its fragile seams. When the pale light of morning finally pressed against the frost-coated fabric, he felt as if he had never closed his eyes at all. Yet the coordinates glowing on his tracker were as sharp and undeniable as they had been before, a silent insistence that whatever he had touched the previous day was not a dream formed by exhaustion. He forced himself through the same ritual of discipline that had brought him safely to so many hostile places before. He ate even though he had no appetite, warmed his fingers until they no longer burned, and checked his equipment with mechanical precision. Outside, the wind was already on the move, not violent yet, but restless, as if searching for weaknesses. The sky was a dull plate of metal, offering no promise of calm, but no immediate threat either. It was a narrow window, and he knew better than to waste it. The return to the ledge was harder than the descent had been the day before. Overnight, the snow had been rearranged by the wind, erasing some of his tracks and disguising the subtle landmarks he had memorized. He advanced with the tracker in one hand and his eyes constantly sweeping the slopes above, searching for the faintest hint of slab formation. More than once, he halted entirely, letting his pulse settle while he probed the snow ahead, listening for the hollow echo that could signal hidden instability. When he reached the approximate location of the glint he had seen, there was nothing at first. The ledge looked no different from 100 others scattered across the ridge, a sterile blend of ice and drifted powder. Doubt crept in, cold and insidious. He checked the coordinates again, then again, stepping carefully along the contour until the numbers aligned precisely with the mark he had left. Only then did he kneel and begin to brush away the surface with slow, deliberate movements. The fragment reappeared almost reluctantly, a dull arc pushing through the crust as if the glacier itself were undecided about surrendering its secret. This time, he took the time to examine the surrounding area before touching anything else. He drove his probe into the snow at regular intervals, mapping the density of the layer beneath. The readings told a troubling story. The solid resistance he felt was not confined to a single point. It extended laterally beneath the ice, forming a buried mass that spanned several meters at least. He anchored a rope to a stable outcrop and clipped himself in before he dared to clear more of the surface. The glacier made small sounds as he worked, tiny cracks and sighs that might have meant nothing at all or everything. He removed the snow in thin layers, refusing the urge to hurry even when the cold began to creep into his wrists. Gradually, the curve he had glimpsed before resolved into a section of metal skin, its surface mottled with corrosion yet unmistakably manufactured. There were rivets along its edge, spaced with a precision that no natural formation could imitate. The realization settled slowly, as heavy as the ice pressing down on the object itself. This was not debris dropped by some recent expedition, nor the wreckage of a modern aircraft. The design was older, the craftsmanship belonging to an era when metal had been bent by hand and reinforced with patience rather than algorithms. As he uncovered more, the curvature grew broader, suggesting a cylindrical form far larger than any wing or fuselage fragment he could place in his memory. A sudden tremor shuddered through the ledge, subtle but undeniable. Marcus froze, heart hammering as he waited for the follow-up roar of a slab release that did not come. The glacier settled back into its deceptive stillness, but the message was clear. He was standing on the thin edge between discovery and disaster. Whatever lay beneath him was massive enough to have reshaped the ice around it, creating voids and stress lines that had no place on an ordinary slope. He retreated a meter, then another, testing each step before transferring his weight. From this safer position, he studied the exposed section, letting his mind assemble the pieces his eyes could not yet see. The pattern of rivets, the smoothness of the curve, the scale implied by the way the ice bowed around it all pointed toward a single conclusion he was reluctant to accept. He was looking at the outer skin of an airship, a relic from the age when humanity had trusted vast envelopes of gas to carry it across continents. The notion felt absurd in the sterile light of that nameless ridge. Dirigibles belonged to sepia-toned photographs and grainy newsreels, not to a glacier that had claimed them in silence. Yet the evidence was there, cold and undeniable beneath his gloves. He found what appeared to be the rim of a hatch or service opening, its outline distorted by decades of pressure but still readable to anyone willing to look closely. The wind picked up again, flinging needles of snow into his face and filling the shallow depression he had cleared. His fingers were losing dexterity, and the rope tugged lightly at his harness as the ridge reminded him of the imbalance he had introduced. He took a final set of photographs, careful to include the broader context of the slope and the anchoring point that marked the scale of what lay hidden. Only then did he allow himself to feel the weight of the moment. The coordinates he had marked the night before were no longer abstract numbers. They were a doorway into a forgotten chapter of human endeavor, one that had been sealed away not by malice or conspiracy, but by the indifferent persistence of ice. He knew that returning alone with more tools would be folly. This was no longer a private puzzle to be solved in the margins of a solitary journey. It was a responsibility, and it was larger than him. As he prepared to leave, the sky dimmed in the way that only high mountains know, not darkening so much as withdrawing its light, leaving the world drained of depth. He secured the area as best he could, building a small cairn of stones above the spot where the metal vanished back into the glacier. It was a gesture more symbolic than practical, but he wanted a physical marker to stand alongside the electronic ones he carried with him. The descent was a study in restraint. He moved as if the mountain itself were watching, measuring every impulse against the risk it introduced. By the time he reached the basin and the relative shelter of his route back to the valley, the wind had grown into a constant howl that erased the sound of his own passage. It was as if the ridge were already working to erase the traces of his intrusion, drawing its veil of snow across the wound he had opened. At his shelter, he shed his pack with hands that trembled from more than cold. He did not open the few small containers he had prepared for samples. He did not try to pry loose any fragment of the metal he had seen. Instead, he sat in the narrow space between gear and fabric wall and stared at the blank screen of his tracker until he reactivated it, rechecked the coordinates, and sent a brief encrypted message to a contact he trusted in a university department far from the mountains. It contained no speculation, only the facts as he had recorded them and the precise location where ice had yielded to something older than the glacier itself. When he finally lay down, the wind still tearing at the shelter like an animal denied entry. The image of that curved metal followed him into a shallow, restless sleep. He had come to the ridge seeking lines no one else had drawn, but what he had found instead was a buried presence, waiting with the patience of stone to be seen again. By the time Marcus began his third ascent toward the hidden object, the ridge had already claimed a piece of him. The muscles in his legs felt dense and unresponsive, as though the cold had reached inside his body and stiffened the machinery that kept him upright. Yet, the message he had sent from his shelter the previous evening had changed the nature of his solitude. He was no longer an isolated rider acting on a private impulse. Somewhere, far beyond the frozen valleys, specialists were reading his coordinates, examining the images he had transmitted, trying to reconcile them with everything they thought they knew about early aviation. They had urged him not to disturb the site further, to wait until a proper expedition could be assembled, but he had also been warned of something equally troubling. The weather system advancing across the range was not benign. In less than 2 days, the ridge might be swallowed by snow, heavy enough to erase every trace he had uncovered. It was not curiosity that drove him back, but a sense of duty that felt heavier than any pack he had ever carried. He limited himself to a single insulated container, sterilized and ready to receive anything that might be irreparably damaged if left where it lay. He told himself again and again that he would not pry or tear or force. He would only look, only document, only take what was already loose or at risk of destruction. The ledge greeted him with the same deceptive calm it had worn the day before, its surface now smoothed by a fresh layer of wind-driven powder. He re-established his anchor point with care, the rope humming faintly as he clipped in and tested the tension. The glacier's voice was quieter today, not because it had settled, but because the growing storm masked its subtle complaints beneath a continuous moan of wind. He cleared the snow until the familiar curve of metal reappeared, then followed it laterally, tracing the outline of what he now understood to be a massive hull. The ice around it bore scars of long pressure, faint lines radiating outward like stress fractures in ancient glass. They told the story of impact, of a sudden arrival that had driven this object into the heart of the glacier where it had remained, perfectly entombed, while the world above forgot it. The hatch was more fragile than he had expected. Time had eaten into the rivets, and the metal around the frame had thinned, its strength preserved only by the cold that locked its molecules in a place. He worked slowly, using controlled leverage rather than force, warming the seam just enough to loosen its grip without shocking the structure. When the opening finally gave, it did so with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the vastness of the ridge, a brittle sigh like a breath released after a century of restraint. The interior was not dark so much as muted. His headlamp revealed a narrow cabin frozen in the middle of its own history, the instruments dulled by a uniform crust of ice that softened their lines without erasing their purpose. Dials stared back at him with glassy indifference, their needles fixed forever at the last readings taken by hands long gone. The air inside was painfully cold, colder even than the wind outside, a stillness that had never been disturbed by heat or motion since the day the glacier claimed it. He moved as if entering a cathedral. Every step was measured, his weight distributed across points he tested repeatedly before trusting them. The floor beneath the frost showed no sign of collapse, but he could feel the subtle flex that came from standing on a structure never meant to bear the pressure of a mountain. His beam slid across the cabin walls, picking out the shapes of levers, gauges, and the faint ghost of lettering stamped into metal plates. There were no decorations, no indulgences. Everything spoke of function, of a craft built for a single daring purpose and nothing else. On what must have been the pilot's seat, he found the object that stopped him cold. A leather satchel lay there, its straps stiffened by ice, its surface etched with fine cracks where time had gnawed at the hide. It was not arranged carefully. It had fallen, perhaps in a moment of chaos, and then had been sealed in place by the slow advance of cold. He did not touch it at first. He photographed it where it lay, then the surrounding controls, then the entire cabin from as many angles as his narrow position allowed. Only when he was satisfied that he had captured its context did he begin the delicate process of freeing it from the seat. The leather resisted, not with strength, but with a stubborn adherence born of decades frozen into the fabric beneath. He worked the edge of a gloved finger between the satchel and the metal, breaking the bond millimeter by millimeter until the two surfaces parted with a sound like tearing paper. He cradled the bag against his chest for a moment, feeling its unexpected weight, the sense that it held more than documents, that it carried the residue of intention. He placed it gently into the insulated container he had brought, sealing it without opening it, trusting the cold to preserve whatever secrets lay inside until it could be handled by people with the means to do so safely. Only then did he allow himself to look deeper into the cabin. Along the wall to his right, he noticed a cylindrical object bolted into place, and its surface dulled but intact, protected by a thick metal collar. He recognized the form from his research into early exploration equipment. This was not a fuel tank or a component of the craft itself. It was a storage vessel designed to keep its contents dry and intact under conditions far harsher than any museum environment. The bolts that held it had been tightened by someone who believed they would return to retrieve it. Removing it required patience. The metal groaned as he loosened the fastenings, a low complaint that made him pause again and again to ensure he was not disturbing the surrounding structure. When it finally came free, he felt the subtle shift in balance that came from holding something that had been fixed in place longer than he had been alive. He carried it to the navigation table, a flat surface whose edges were softened by ice, and set it down with care. The table itself was a map of a world that no longer existed. Beneath a film of frost lay charts, their ink lines blurred but still legible in places, showing coastlines and routes that had once been nothing more than speculation. The instruments scattered across it were simple by modern standards, but carried the unmistakable authority of tools that had been trusted with lives. The cylinder opened with a faint hiss of displaced air, the seal surrendering after its long vigil. Inside were documents wrapped in layers of waxed paper, their edges yellowed but intact, protected by the same cold that had claimed the men who wrote them. Marcus did not unfold them. He did not even attempt to read a word. He recognized immediately that exposure to warmer air could undo in seconds what a century of ice had preserved. He photographed the contents in situ, resealed the vessel, and placed it beside the satchel in his container. Only then did he notice the smaller details that transformed the scene from an archaeological site into a moment suspended in human tragedy. A glove lay wedged between two panels, its fingers curled as if in anticipation of movement that never came. A metal mug was fixed to a hook near the wall, its rim etched with tiny dents that suggested repeated use. These were not relics of a grand narrative, but the residue of ordinary lives interrupted. A gust of wind roared through the open hatch, scattering fine snow across the cabin floor and jolting him back to the present. The storm he had been watching from afar was no longer content to remain a distant threat. It had reached the ridge, and with it came the certainty that he had only minutes, not hours, to retreat before the mountain reclaimed its silence. He sealed the hatch as best he could, reinforcing it with a light layer of snow to buffer it against the worst of the wind. The rope trembled as he clipped back in and eased himself away from the opening, the weight of the insulated container pulling at his shoulders like a tangible burden of history. The descent was hurried now, not reckless, but stripped of any lingering reverence. He was acutely aware that the cabin behind him was a place of death, not mystery, and that the men who had occupied it had not chosen to become part of an enigma. By the time he reached the basin, the storm had fully arrived. Snow flew in horizontal sheets, erasing the tracks of his ascent almost as soon as he made them. His shelter was a dim silhouette against the whitening world, and he dove into it with a relief that bordered on gratitude. Inside, with the wind screaming beyond the thin walls, he sat hunched over the container that held the satchel and the sealed cylinder. He did not open them. He only checked the temperature, ensuring the cold was maintained, and then secured them in the most insulated corner of his pack. The coordinates of the site glowed steadily on his tracker, but they were no longer enough. He was now carrying the first tangible proof that the ridge concealed more than a curiosity. It concealed a story that had waited in silence for someone disciplined enough to listen. The storm trapped Marcus in his shelter for almost 2 full days. It battered the fabric walls with such relentless force that the thin aluminum poles vibrated like tuning forks, filling the cramped space with a constant metallic hum. Outside, the ridge had vanished behind a white curtain that erased any sense of distance or orientation. Even opening the flap for a few seconds was enough to coat his eyelashes with ice and steal the warmth from his breath. He had no choice but to wait, listening to the wind scour the mountain, while the insulated container at his side became the heaviest object in the world, not by mass, but by meaning. When the weather finally loosened its grip, it did so reluctantly. The wind softened to an exhausted moan, and the snow fell straight down instead of sideways, as though the storm were retreating under protest. Marcus did not rush his departure. He needed to descend safely with what he now carried, and the ridge had made it clear that impatience was the currency of the dead. The route down was longer than the one he had used on his ascent, chosen for stability rather than speed. He followed the basin until it opened into a glacial valley that funneled him away from the cliffs, moving through terrain that felt almost forgiving by comparison. The container never left his back, even when he stopped to rest, and more than once he caught himself checking its seals with bare fingers, as though he feared it might simply dissolve into the cold air if he did not confirm its presence. It took the better part of a day to reach a point where his tracker finally re-established a stronger link to the satellite network. The first real message he sent was no longer a set of coordinates, but a report. It was factual, stripped of speculation, describing the location, the nature of the object beneath the ice, the measures he had taken to avoid contamination, and the condition of the materials he had removed. He attached the images he had taken inside the cabin, compressing them to meet the limits of his fragile connection, and then waited as the device processed the transmission in silence. The reply arrived in fragments, delayed by the lingering interference of the retreating storm, but when it came together it carried a tone he had never encountered in professional correspondence. It was cautious to the point of reverence. The specialists he had contacted did not dismiss the photographs or ask him to repeat basic information. They asked instead about the rivet patterns, the composition of the instruments, the design of the satchel. They wanted to know if the maps showed longitudes or bearings that could be cross-referenced with early 20th century navigation methods. Their questions were not those of skeptics looking for flaws, but of minds already grappling with the implications of what they were seeing. By the time Marcus reached the small town at the edge of the mountain region, the situation had shifted beyond anything he had anticipated. His arrival was quiet, unremarkable to anyone watching him unload his pack in a dimly lit hostel, but his inbox was filling with messages marked urgent. A university laboratory 2 states away offered climate-controlled transport for the artifacts. A museum curator asked whether he had preserved the context of the find with adequate photographic documentation. An aviation historian, whose work Marcus had read years earlier, requested a direct call as soon as conditions allowed. He did not open the satchel or the cylinder in the warmth of his room. Instead, he placed the insulated container near the window, where the winter air kept it cold, and wrapped it in additional layers to prevent any fluctuation in temperature. Only then did he allow himself to sit and look through the images he had captured, enlarging them on his laptop screen until the frozen cabin filled his vision. The more he studied the details, the more they refused to fit neatly into any narrative he knew. The instruments were not crude experiments, but carefully engineered devices, consistent with designs that had only been theorized in the years before the First World War. The maps on the navigation table were not copies of known commercial routes. They traced arcs across the Atlantic that bypassed the corridors historians had always assumed were the earliest viable paths. The ink annotations, blurred but legible in places, referenced meteorological conditions with a precision that suggested this crew had not merely hoped to survive their crossing. They had expected to. He shared the images in a secure channel with the experts who had reached out to him. The responses came in waves, each building on the last. Metallurgists identified alloy compositions that matched experimental manufacturing processes abandoned by major firms after a series of public failures. Archivists began cross-referencing names they could barely make out on the leather satchel with employment records from defunct airship companies. A pattern emerged slowly, like a ghostly outline forming beneath layers of old paper. What disturbed Marcus most was not the possibility that the ridge concealed a forgotten aircraft. It was the growing certainty that this particular aircraft had accomplished something the world believed impossible at the time. The partial coordinates visible on the navigation charts aligned with wind patterns over the North Atlantic that modern models confirmed would have made a westward crossing feasible during a narrow seasonal window in 1910. The timestamps in the bunched fragments of the logbook, deciphered through high-resolution imaging, placed the craft's departure years before the flights enshrined in textbooks as the dawn of transoceanic aviation. The experts were careful in their language. They spoke of hypotheses, of the need for controlled studies and chain-of-custody documentation. But between those lines Marcus could read the same disbelief that pulsed through his own thoughts. If the documents were genuine, if the cabin he had entered was not a carefully staged anomaly, then the men who had piloted that airship had achieved a milestone that had been erased by circumstance rather than falsified by malice. That erasure raised its own questions. Why had there been no search? Why did the project not appear in the archives of the companies whose technological fingerprints were now visible in the metal and paper? An investigative team began to comb through shipping manifests, insurance records, and the personal correspondence of engineers who had vanished from public view around the same time. They found references to a private venture funded by industrialists whose names still adorned modern institutions, but whose riskier experiments had been quietly buried after catastrophic losses. As the story took shape, Marcus felt a new pressure bearing down on him, one that had nothing to do with altitude or weather. Requests arrived not only from academics but from individuals whose interest in the find was framed in language that felt uncomfortably proprietary. They offered to purchase the artifacts to relocate them to private facilities where their preservation could be guaranteed. Others hinted that revealing the full implications of the discovery might provoke legal challenges or political discomfort that could delay or derail the research entirely. He refused all such overtures. He had not risked his life on a nameless ridge to become a broker in a shadow economy of forgotten achievements. The more resistance he encountered, the more determined he became to ensure that the site and its contents were documented transparently, under the scrutiny of institutions that answered to the public rather than to hidden stakeholders. By the end of the week, a plan had begun to solidify. A small, interdisciplinary team would travel to the region under the guise of a routine glaciological survey, securing the necessary permits and safety infrastructure to approach the site properly. The artifacts Marcus had removed would be transported in a refrigerated container to a conservation lab equipped to stabilize materials that had not felt warmth in a century. Every step would be recorded, every movement logged, leaving no room for accusations of tampering or embellishment. The night before the team was scheduled to arrive, Marcus stood at the window of his room, watching snow drift lazily through the halo of a streetlight. Somewhere beyond the dark outline of the distant mountains, the ridge held its breath beneath a fresh mantle of ice. He no longer felt alone with the knowledge he had uncovered, but he felt the weight of it more keenly than ever. What had begun as a solitary descent along forgotten trails had become the opening act of a reckoning that would reach far beyond any line he had ever carved into the snow. The town at the foot of the mountains had never imagined itself a gateway to history. It was a place of truck stops and weather-beaten storefronts, where the rhythm of life followed the arrival of storms more closely than the calendar. Yet, within days of Marcus's descent, it became a temporary capital of a quiet but relentless investigation. Researchers arrived in pairs and then in clusters, moving through the narrow streets with the subdued urgency of people who understood that their work could collapse under its own weight if handled too loudly. The artifacts Marcus had recovered were transferred to a provisional cold storage unit installed in a municipal building that usually hosted winter markets. The hum of refrigeration filled the empty hall, echoing against concrete walls that bore no witness to the magnitude of what lay sealed within. He watched from a distance as technicians in insulated gloves moved the container onto a steel table, their movements slow and deliberate. The choreography of people who had spent careers learning how to treat fragile remnants of the past as if they were still alive. The first real insights came not from the objects themselves, but from the archives. While conservators stabilized the satchel and the metal cylinder in conditions that mimicked the interior of the glacier, historians scattered into libraries and digital repositories across continents. They searched not for the name of the airship, but for absences, for projects that had flared briefly into existence and then vanished without explanation. It was tedious work, a matter of scanning old corporate reports, forgotten patent filings, obscure references in trade journals whose readership had dwindled to a handful of specialists. Gradually, a pattern emerged. Around the turn of the 20th century, several private engineering firms in Western Europe had been experimenting with rigid airship designs that differed markedly from the publicly celebrated models of the time. These ventures were not funded by governments or military institutions, but by consortia of industrial magnates who saw the skies as an untapped corridor for commerce and prestige. They filed patents for composite hull structures and variable buoyancy systems, then quietly withdrew those applications when the technology proved volatile and investors lost patience. One such project, referred to only obliquely in a series of letters preserved in a family archive, appeared to have reached an advanced stage in early 1910. The correspondence spoke of a vessel designed not merely to cross oceans, but to chart them from above, gathering meteorological data that shipping companies could leverage for decades to come. It mentioned a test flight scheduled under conditions of extreme secrecy, its departure delayed repeatedly by unfavorable weather until a narrow window presented itself in the late spring. What the letters did not mention was any successful return. The documents in the sealed cylinder began to yield their secrets, as the conservators brought them slowly to a temperature where the paper could be handled without crumbling. Each page was photographed under controlled light, the images then magnified and distributed to the team for analysis. The logbook was written in a precise, unadorned hand, its entries devoted to bearings, airspeed estimates, and the condition of the craft. There was no grand narrative, no reflection on the daring nature of the mission. It read like the work of professionals who believed that their endeavor was not extraordinary but inevitable. The coordinates they had recorded traced a path that defied conventional assumptions. Instead of following the southern routes favored by early aviators to avoid the strongest headwinds, the airship had ventured into latitudes considered perilous even for ships, let alone lighter than aircraft. The reason for this audacity lay in the margins of the charts, where faint annotations described prevailing currents that could be harnessed to carry the vessel farther than its engines alone would allow. The final entries were terse. The airship had encountered deteriorating weather over mountainous terrain during its return leg, conditions that forced the crew to attempt a crossing at altitudes for which the craft had not been designed. The words on the page grew tighter, the spacing between lines narrowing as if the writer had been aware that time was slipping beyond his control. The last complete note ended not with a flourish, but with a calculation, a cold acknowledgment of diminishing lift in the face of accumulating ice. There were no records after that. No farewell, no expression of fear or regret. Only the abrupt silence that had allowed the expedition to vanish from history as thoroughly as it had from the sky. As these revelations accumulated, Marcus found himself grappling with the strange inversion of his role. He had not set out to become a custodian of forgotten ambition, yet he was now the hinge on which a century of misunderstanding turned. His own life felt improbably small in the face of the narrative unfolding around him, and yet it was his restraint, his refusal to tear at the past in pursuit of spectacle, that had preserved the evidence long enough for others to read it. The investigators began reconstructing the final hours of the flight with a precision that bordered on obsession. Using modern meteorological models, they simulated the storm systems described in the logbook, mapping them against the topography of the ridge where the wreck lay entombed. The data aligned with unsettling clarity. A sudden downdraft combined with icing on the envelope would have forced the airship into a desperate maneuver, one that might have saved it from plunging into a valley only to drive it instead into the teeth of the mountains. The glacier had done the rest. Over time it had flowed around the broken hull, sealing it away beneath layers of snow that compacted into ice, erasing the visible scars of the impact until even the ridge itself seemed unaware of the burden it carried. The human dimension of the story began to surface as well. Through census records and employment rosters, the team identified the likely crew members, men whose families had received vague notices of disappearance or no notice at all. Some were listed as having died at sea years later, their fates conflated with maritime disasters that bore no relation to their actual end. It was not a conspiracy in the modern sense, but a bureaucratic convenience, the smoothing over of uncomfortable failures in an age that preferred triumph to tragedy. Marcus attended the meetings where these findings were presented, sitting at the edge of long tables covered in printouts and annotated photographs. He listened as scholars debated the implications for aviation history, how this flight, if acknowledged, would predate and complicate the heroic narratives that had dominated the field for generations. Yet, what stayed with him were not the arguments about precedence or recognition. It was the image of that frozen glove in the cabin, the mug still hanging from its hook, the small human traces that transformed the airship from a technological artifact into a tomb. By the end of the month, the outlines of the lost expedition were clear enough to stand on their own. The craft had been an experimental vessel, financed by private interests, launched in secrecy to test the limits of contemporary engineering. It had succeeded beyond expectation in crossing the Atlantic, only to be undone by the very ambition that had driven it aloft. Its disappearance had been absorbed into the general fog of an era that was already teetering toward global conflict, its memory buried not by malice, but by the overwhelming momentum of history itself. What remained was to return to the ridge, to retrieve the rest of the evidence before the glacier claimed it forever, and to ensure that the men who had risked everything in pursuit of the sky would no longer be reduced to a footnote, or worse, to nothing at all. By the time the scientific expedition assembled at the edge of the mountain range, winter had tightened its grip once more. What had seemed like a brief interlude of relative calm after Marcus's discovery had given way to a renewed cycle of storms, as though the ridge itself were testing the resolve of those who now sought to disturb its long-kept secret. Yet there was no turning back. The story of the lost airship was no longer speculation whispered among specialists. It had become a responsibility that demanded action before time erased what little remained. The team was small by design. Glaciologists, aviation historians, conservation scientists, and 2 veteran alpine rescuers formed the core of the group, each chosen not only for expertise, but for the discipline to operate in silence and restraint. Permits had been secured through environmental agencies that viewed the expedition as a limited-impact geological survey, a framing that protected the site from the curious while ensuring compliance with regulations designed to safeguard fragile mountain ecosystems. Marcus stood among them as both witness and guide, the one person who knew the ridge not as an abstract contour on a map, but as a place that had already drawn blood in the form of exhaustion and near-miss catastrophe. The ascent followed a route that prioritized safety over directness. Heavy packs weighed down every step, filled with scanning equipment, insulated containers, and instruments designed to map the glacier's interior without carving into it. The air grew thinner with every meter of elevation, and the silence that accompanied their progress was punctuated only by the rhythmic crunch of crampons and the measured calls of the lead climber marking changes in terrain. When the ledge finally came into view, it bore the scars of a winter that had not relented. The cairn Marcus had built months earlier was half buried, its stones fused together by ice as if the mountain were attempting to erase his handwriting from its surface. He felt a surge of relief when the glaciologist's instruments confirmed what he already knew by instinct. Beneath the snow, the metal hull remained, its presence distorting the density readings in a way that could not be mistaken for natural variation. Work began immediately, governed by a protocol that treated the site not as a wreck, but as a living system whose balance could be fatally disrupted by careless intervention. Laser scanners were positioned around the exposed curve. their beams painting the air with invisible grids that translated the glacier's contours into three-dimensional maps. Photogrammetry followed, each image calibrated to capture not only the shape of the hull but the subtle shifts in the ice that had embraced it over the decades. Marcus watched as the craft he had first glimpsed in isolation was now rendered into data, its form unfolding across laptop screens in real time. It was both gratifying and unsettling. The airship was losing its mystery, becoming measurable, its story increasingly accessible to minds that had never felt the cold breath of the ridge. Selective openings were made under the supervision of the conservation team, who worked within temperature-controlled tents erected over the most sensitive areas. No attempt was made to excavate the entire hull. Instead, they focused on compartments likely to contain identifying features, guided by the logbook's descriptions and the structural scans that revealed interior divisions. Every bolt turned was recorded, every fragment cataloged, the process more akin to surgery than exploration. The first of the definitive markers emerged from a corroded panel near what had once been the engineering section. A manufacturer's plate, dulled by time but intact, bore the imprint of a company that had vanished from public records before the First World War. Its serial number matched a series of patents filed and then withdrawn in 1909, a paper trail that had previously been dismissed as a financial misadventure rather than the blueprint of a machine that had actually flown. Elsewhere, they uncovered the remains of navigation instruments whose calibration scales were specific to experimental methodologies known only from technical correspondence. Metallurgical analysis of small samples confirmed that the hull had been constructed from a lightweight alloy developed in a laboratory that closed its doors amid scandal less than a year after the airship's disappearance. Piece by piece, the evidence assembled itself into a narrative that could not be dismissed as coincidence or fabrication. The logistical challenges of the operation rivaled its scientific significance. Temperatures fluctuated unpredictably, forcing the team to adjust their schedules daily to protect both personnel and artifacts. The ridge was no passive backdrop. It shifted and creaked beneath their feet, a constant reminder that the glacier's patience was finite. More than once, work was suspended mid-procedure as the rescuers detected stress patterns that signaled an imminent release of ice higher on the slope. Yet, the most profound shift occurred not in the field, but in the laboratories that received the first wave of samples. As carbon dating, ink analysis, and spectroscopic studies converged on the same time frame, the margin for doubt narrowed to almost nothing. The documents were not reproductions. The metal was not a later substitution. The airship had been built, launched, and lost exactly when the logbook said it was. The implications rippled outward with a force that surprised even those who had anticipated controversy. Aviation historians who had spent careers teaching a linear progression of achievement now faced data that rewrote the early chapters of their discipline. The carefully curated pantheon of pioneers had to make room for names that had been erased not by falsification, but by the simple brutality of circumstance. Attempts to suppress the findings emerged almost immediately, cloaked in concerns about national heritage and proprietary research rights. Marcus found himself in meetings with legal advisors who spoke of jurisdiction and ownership, of the delicate balance between discovery and exploitation. He listened with a patience born of mountain solitude, unmoved by arguments that treated the ridge as a bargaining chip rather than a grave. Public interest could no longer be contained. A single image, released through an academic journal, showing the reconstructed hull model alongside the original navigation charts, ignited a wave of coverage that reached far beyond the circles of specialized scholarship. Viewers were not drawn solely by the promise of a historical correction. They were captivated by the idea that the world still harbored such secrets, that even in an age of satellites and databases, there remained stories waiting in silence beneath the ice. For Marcus, the turning point came when he was invited to examine the fully stabilized logbook in a climate-controlled room hundreds of miles from the mountains. The pages lay open beneath a pane of glass, their ink dark against the pale fibers of the paper. He traced the final line with his eyes, following the meticulous script to the place where it ended abruptly, not with a flourish, but with the cold mathematics of survival. It was then he understood that the evidence could no longer be hidden, not because of media attention or institutional pressure, but because it had finally found a language the world could not ignore. The ridge had given up its truth, and no amount of hesitation or vested interest could force it back into silence. The announcement did not arrive with fanfare. It emerged first as a peer-reviewed paper published in a journal few people outside the academic world had ever read. Its title, dry and technical, its abstract devoid of drama. Yet, within hours it began to travel, pulled from databases by journalists who recognized the magnitude hidden behind its careful phrasing. The document laid out, with the precision of mathematics, the chain of evidence that linked the airship entombed in the glacier to a transatlantic flight conducted years before any officially acknowledged crossing. It did not proclaim a revolution. It simply presented data that refused to bend. From there, the story took on a life of its own. Major universities convened emergency symposiums. Aviation museums issued statements that balanced caution with barely concealed excitement. The names of the forgotten crew, reconstructed from payroll records and family registries, appeared in print for the first time in a century. They were no longer anonymous initials in a ledger or shadows in a frozen cabin. They became men with childhood addresses, with school records, with descendants who had grown up believing their ancestors had vanished at sea or drifted into obscurity. For some families, the revelation arrived like a second bereavement, reopening wounds long thought closed. For others, it was an answer that generations had been denied, a quiet vindication that loss had not meant insignificance. Marcus watched this unfold with a mixture of detachment and awe. The mountain had been a place of solitude, yet it had given birth to a public reckoning that now stretched across continents. He received invitations to speak, to appear on programs that thrived on spectacle, but he declined most of them. When he did agree to attend a conference, it was only on the condition that the focus remain on the evidence and the men whose lives had been swallowed by the glacier. He spoke not of courage in the abstract, but of restraint, of the discipline that had kept him from tearing at the cabin in pursuit of a souvenir. The academic response was not uniformly celebratory. Some historians challenged the interpretation of the data, arguing that extraordinary claims required extraordinary proof even when the proof lay in front of them. Yet each critique prompted a deeper dive into the materials, and each reanalysis reinforced the same conclusion. The route traced in the logbook matched wind models reconstructed from ice core samples. The metallurgy aligned with experimental alloys documented in a handful of forgotten patents. The calibration of the instruments corresponded to techniques that would not enter mainstream practice for another decade. The airship had flown, and it had done so in a sky that the world believed had been empty. Gradually, the language of doubt softened. Textbooks were not rewritten overnight, but new editions began to include a footnote, then a paragraph, then entire sections devoted to the lost expedition. The story of early aviation, once told as a clean arc from one celebrated name to the next, became messier and more human, acknowledging the role of private ventures and failed enterprises in shaping progress. The pioneers who had once occupied the margins of the record stepped into the light, their achievements no longer overshadowed by the catastrophe that had claimed them. In the mountain region itself, the transformation was more subtle but no less profound. The unnamed ridge acquired a provisional designation in scientific literature, not a grandiose title, but a functional reference that anchored it in the cartography of discovery. Local authorities, guided by conservation experts, designated the site a protected memorial zone. The glacier would not be stripped of its burden. The remaining sections of the airship would be left where they lay, monitored through non-invasive methods that allowed the ice to continue its slow work while preserving the context of the find. Visitors would never stand inside the cabin or touch the metal skin. They would know it only through images and data, through the story that had finally escaped its frozen vault. For Marcus, the shift from anonymity to recognition was disorienting. He returned to seasonal work, to the quiet rhythms that had defined his life before the ridge intervened. Yet, he was no longer simply a snowboarder chasing empty lines. He was the man who had stumbled upon a century of forgotten ambition and refused to let it be lost again. There were moments when he missed the simplicity of those days when the mountain was nothing more than a challenge of balance and endurance. Now, every ascent carried with it the echo of that first metallic glint beneath the snow, the reminder that the landscape was layered with stories as deep as any crevasse. The final closure came not in a lecture hall or a museum gallery, but in the form of a small ceremony held at the edge of the glacier. There were no cameras, no grand speeches, only a handful of scientists, a few family members of the crew, and Marcus himself standing in the thin air as snow drifted lazily around them. A plaque was installed at a respectful distance from the site, its inscription simple, naming the airship, the date of its flight, and the men who had never returned. It did not claim to right every wrong or answer every question. It merely acknowledged that they had been there, that they had crossed an ocean long before the world was ready to remember them. As the group dispersed, Marcus lingered, watching the ridge absorb the last traces of their presence. The glacier was unchanged, as it always would be, its slow movements indifferent to human milestones. Yet beneath its surface lay proof that progress was not always linear, that the path of discovery was as fractured and unpredictable as the mountains themselves. He turned away at last, descending along a route that felt strangely familiar despite the years that had passed since his first solitary ride. The line was still there, etched faintly into the snow, but it no longer belonged only to him. It had become a thread in a far larger tapestry, one that wove together courage and loss, secrecy and revelation, and the enduring truth that even the most isolated places can reshape the way the world understands itself. Before you go, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what we uncover next. Watch our other investigations and stay with us as hidden stories continue to surface. Share this video with friends and family and help these forgotten truths reach the world.